There is a little bit of debate among scholars, particularly, and Christians in general, about whether or not the Gospels were originally anonymous, though the scholarly consensus by far is that the Gospels were anonymous. That is, when they were first written, there wasn't a name attached to them. So the top of the document didn't say the Gospel of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Thinking Theologically podcast, the show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Dodge, and joined by the resident master theologian in training.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Something like that.
Fantastic. Whatever.
One of these days, we'll get it right from the start.
Titles don't matter. That's the point of our discussion today anyway, so who cares?
Fair. That's a fair point.
Who cares? Welcome back to the episode here. We did 2 weeks ago a foundational episode that this one is going to build on, and many of our following episodes. So if you haven't listened to what is episode 81, I don't know what the title is. I don't have it in front of me, but what is
Reading the Bible and Understanding Christianity as Story.
There we go. If you have not listened to that one yet or watched, you're going to want to do that first. You're not going to be lost, but it would be helpful as we navigate discussions and stuff like that. So today we're going to talk about who wrote the Gospel of Mark. You can probably predict with good accuracy what some of our future episodes may hold as discussions based on that particular title. But we're going to go through this, and at the end, if you are maybe seeing the title and wondering, like, who cares? Why are we talking about this? Mark wrote it. It's called Mark. Why should we even discuss it? That'll be at the end that we have a discussion about those things. But if you're listening and all that stuff, then this stuff must matter to you in some way. So thanks for being a part of the discussion. Go ahead.
Or you're a Bible nerd like me. I will say this episode and kind of what we're going to be talking about moving forward regarding the Gospels, this is not only my area of expertise, but this is what I love to do, the kind of historical side of particularly Jesus studies. And I say that because you can do the history of Paul or history of Israel.
Sure,
My thing is kind of Jesus, early Christianity. So more of that's like, how did the historical ministry of Jesus produce the early Christian communities that we see? So that's a little concerned with like Paul, but like, how do we get Pauline communities from a historical Jesus? Like, what did that? And so the Gospels are kind of at the center of that. So historical gospel related.
So there'll be quite a bit of information historically and scholarly discussion and all of those things brought to bear in these particular discussions here, including this one. Before we get into it, which today's episode, by the way, is just structured as questions. I'm just going to be the question asker. I don't even know how much I'll have to contribute to the overall discussion, maybe a little bit at the end, but I'm just asking questions, and Spencer's going to run with answers here and all this. But we want to encourage you to check us out on Facebook. We have a page there. We don't just do these episodes. We also have written articles. One of them at the time of the recording is up. It's Thursday the 20th that we're recording this. New article just went up. If you're not on Facebook or checking out thinkingtheologically.org, you have no idea that exists. So make sure you check that out. And anywhere you get your podcasts, we should be there for you as well. And anywhere you want to reach out to us, either at strongchurchministries@gmail.com or on the Facebook Messenger, or just find Spencer on all the socials.
All of them.
All the socials. Yep. I aged out. We're like the same age, but we're not. I'm really old. So you can get me on Facebook. That's the only place where I'm at. And I'm on Facebook to post these things and church stuff that I have going on. So reach out there and be on the lookout for future for in the future more content of varying kind coming out from us and all of that. So, all that said, who wrote the Gospel of Mark? That's the overall question. We'll explain that with a bunch of other questions here.
Mm-hmm.
Starting with the broad setting the stage for the future gospel episodes here. Did the original gospels have names attached to them?
So you've might have heard before people talking about the Gospels being anonymous. That's things that a lot of Christians that I come across have heard that or assume that.
Hmm.
Some don't, and so I think that's kind of why this is an important question to begin with. There is a little bit of debate among scholars, particularly, and Christians in general, about whether or not the Gospels were originally anonymous, though the scholarly consensus by far is that the Gospels were anonymous. That is, when they were first written, there wasn't a name attached to them. So the top of the document didn't say the Gospel of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. The Gospel of Mark, for example, just began the first line, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Maybe the Son of God. There's actually debate. There's some textual difficulties there. But it began something like that. So no mention of a author of any kind. However, the debate comes in among scholars and some just, I don't know, average Christians in the pew who want to argue for traditional authorship, that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, so on and so forth. You might hear this come out as well. That we do have to note that we do not possess any extant full copies of the Gospels that do not include the traditionally ascribed names. Now, here's what I mean by that. Extant means copies that we currently possess, that you can go to a museum somewhere and look at. Because we know that there were a lot of copies of the Gospels and really all the documents of the New Testament, including the originals that we don't have anymore. We don't have the originals of any documents of the New Testament. We don't have the first copies of any of the documents in the New Testament. We have copies of copies of copies. And so when I or somebody else talks about extant copies, we're talking about the ones that we have possession of today that you can go and look at. And there are no extant copies, full copies of the Gospels, that is, copies of the full written Gospels that do not include a title that says something like the Gospel according to Matthew or the Gospel according to Mark. Now, what you have to realize is that the earliest copies of the Gospels that we have are fragmentary. An example is P52, which was likely copied somewhere between 125 and 150, so the very beginning of the 2nd century. And it is not only our oldest surviving manuscript, but particularly it is the oldest surviving manuscript of John's Gospel. It contains just a small fragment. I mean, it's about the size of my hand is this fragment. So a very small fragment of John's Gospel. That's the earliest fragment of a manuscript that we possess. And that's a big deal because you think about, most scholars think that John was written in the 90s. Some even put John into the beginning of the 2nd century. I think John was written in the 90s. So if you date P52 early to 120, you're talking about less than 30 years from the original writing of John to when this was copied. Very, very early. But again, John's Gospel is very lengthy. Just go look at it in your New Testament today in much smaller print. It's a lot of pages. I don't know how many on average, more than just a couple. And the earliest fragment that we have is the size of my hand. And so that's what I mean by extant full copies, because we have earlier copies that are partial. But if you have a partial copy like P52, you can't expect to have found a title, even if there was a title on it, because we have, again, a copy the size of my hand. We wouldn't expect to have a title. and we don't. The earliest complete manuscripts that we have of the Gospels include Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both which date to the 4th century, so the 500s. And that's important because you think about these documents that were written mid to late 1st century. The first full manuscripts we have are not all the way until the 500s. So we're talking about, 400 plus, 500 plus years before we have the full copies of these gospels. So there's a long period of time that spans them being written to the complete manuscripts of the gospels that we possess. However, these do contain the traditionally ascribed names, though most scholars believe that they were added later. These do contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The earliest fragments that we have containing titles are P66, which dates to the year around 200, so the beginning of the 3rd century, which reminds me that I messed up when I was talking about the 4th century. It's not the 500s, it's the 300s. So we're talking about 300 years between the writing of the Gospels and the first complete manuscripts in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So the beginning of the 3rd century, we have P66 that has a title that states Gospel according to John. We have P75, which dates to about the same time, though it could be earlier, tail end of the 2nd century to the beginning of the 3rd century, that has 2 titles, according to Luke and according to John. So again, these fragments are separated from the original writing of the document by 150 to 200 years is the earliest fragments that we have that do in fact contain these titles. However, as I said, that leads some scholars to say, well, they always had titles. It was always the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because all the evidence that we have from some of these earlier fragments to the later full manuscripts of the gospels all include titles. And everything that we have where you would expect to find a title, you do have a title. And so they would say they always had a title. And so we could trust from the beginning, it was called the Gospel according to Mark or something like that. However, as I said, most scholars think that the titles were added later, that originally they were anonymous, and that by the time you get these fragments, 150, 200 plus years later, that is when we start to see these titles being added. And there are a couple of reasons that scholars believe this, and I'm going to list a few real quickly. The first is the absence of internal attribution. That is, none of the Gospels internally identify an author. So you read Paul's letter to the Romans. He begins, I, Paul, to the church in Rome. He identifies himself. You read the Gospels, none of them identify an author. Now, I think there's an important exception to make with the Gospel of Luke. Luke doesn't identify himself. I, Luke, am writing this, but he does talk about himself. So the Gospel of Luke begins, I have done this research and I've set it down in this orderly account, because he's writing to Theophilus, who I believe is a real person, likely the patron who's financing the writing of his gospel. And so Luke doesn't need to give his name, because if Theophilus has come to Luke and said, hey, write a gospel, I will pay for it, then Theophilus knows Luke. Luke knows Theophilus. He doesn't need to put his name on it. It would be like Jack coming to me and saying, hey, can you write me a little something that talks about the authorship of the Gospel of Mark? And I do, and I send it to Jack. I don't need to put my name on it because Jack knows who I am. He's the one that asked me to write it. I'm writing it for him. Like, there's no reason to do that. And then that even carries over into Acts. You have a section of Acts where Luke uses the term we, and talking about Paul's, we did this, we did that. And so Luke uses the personal pronouns to talk about himself, but he does not fully identify himself. You might want to make it a exception with John as well, the beloved disciple that a lot of people assume this beloved disciple is John, who's also the author. We'll talk about that when we get to John. That's a little bit problematic to do. But even if that's the case, John doesn't call himself John, nor does he ever say that the beloved disciple is the one who's writing the gospel. And so within the internals of the gospel, there's nothing to suggest an author. The author never identifies themselves. And so it makes it likely that if they don't do that inside the gospel, they probably wouldn't have attached a title to it. Secondly, our earliest fragments either don't have titles or they have inconsistent titles. And that by that I mean sometimes it's the gospel according to Luke, sometimes it's just according to Luke or according to Mark or something like that. And that leads scholars to think, well, if they originally had titles and all you're doing is copying the titles from one piece of papyrus to another piece or whatever it is that you're writing on, you would expect the titles to be relatively consistent, but they are inconsistent. So the name Luke might be there, but the entire title changes from one manuscript to another, which seems to suggest that maybe these are being added afterwards, and that's why we get a bunch of different versions of how the title may look. Third, the church fathers do not uniformly refer to the Gospels the same way or by the same titles. So you go and read the early church fathers, 2nd century, 3rd century, who are talking about, we believe in some cases, the Gospels that we possess, but they don't always call them the same thing. They don't always refer to them in the same way, which again, if they had titles on them from the beginning, you would expect, well, that will allow all of us to refer to them in the same way. Like today, when Jack says the Gospel of John and I say the Gospel of John, we all know we're referring to the same gospel because it has a title. If we're referring to the same gospel in different ways, then you might assume, well, maybe it doesn't have a title, or at least not a consistent title, which might suggest that it didn't have one from the beginning. Fourth, other early gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, did not have titles. So we have examples of other similar works that post-date the Gospels that don't have titles. Fifth, in Codex Vaticanus, one of the earliest complete manuscripts of the Gospels, the titles appear to be written in a slightly different style and ink than the main text, which seems to suggest that the Gospels in Codex Vaticanus were first copied with no titles, and then later on, a different author added the titles, which seems to suggest that the manuscripts that were being copied did not have titles, because you would expect if you're copying it, you would copy the entire thing, including the titles. And since that didn't happen, it brings into question whether or not the originals had titles on them. And then finally, just thinking of historical context, a title would have been unnecessary until the church began using multiple gospels side by side. So you think of the Gospel of Mark, the only gospel in circulation for 10 years, 20 years, something like that, whenever you want to date Matthew, which was probably the next gospel. It's the only gospel circulating. It's the only gospel that many communities would have for decades. And so if you only have one gospel, there's no need for a title because you're not distinguishing it from another gospel. This is just all you have. But once the church, end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, begins to compile these gospels together and to put them in codex or book form, then you have to have some way to distinguish one gospel from the other. And that would then lead to the necessity of adding titles. Well, this one's the gospel according to Matthew. This one's the gospel according to Mark, so that we can distinguish the two. The final thing that I want to say in thinking about this question is even if we accept the historical attributions, so even if we were to say the original Gospel of Mark said the Gospel according to Mark, same with Matthew, Luke, and John. The problem is that we still don't know who these men are. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were very common names in antiquity. I gave this example to Jack when we were talking about this episode before we started recording. I said it would be like me saying, well, this was written by John today. Well, everyone knows multiple Johns. In my family, my dad's name is John. My brother-in-law's name is John. My middle name is John. So even if you said this was written by a John in our family, theoretically, you could be talking about 3 different people. It doesn't help us know which John wrote it. And so that's the other problem of even if it said Mark at the top, well, what Mark are we talking about? Because every other man in antiquity was named Mark or Luke or John or Matthew. And that doesn't, so my point is, even if they had him, it doesn't get us that much closer to knowing which Mark wrote the gospel.
I don't know if, well, I'll mention it here, only, I guess, because I'm thinking about it, though it might fit better in a later place. Feel free to compile and arrange this however you see fit. There's some other books that we read where, because you may be listening to this going, I've never had a question about the authorship of Mark or anything like that. But there are other books that we have, like for New Testament's purposes, Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews. We're like, well, who wrote it? And you've got people throw out Paul or some other number of individuals, but that's another one of those books that's just, well, it was to this audience, and there we go. Or Ecclesiastes, which has a Greek word title for ecclesia, but it is a Hebrew writing. So the title comes much later on down the line than the actual writing of itself. And we don't really care about those. I mean, we read it and we have no problem thinking and all of that. So, this discussion here of Mark, or the future discussions we have of titles and authorship and things like that, you already believe, whether you know it or not. I don't know who the author is of this book, but that's fine. This title came later, but I don't even think about that. I study the book because all of them are sharing with us the truth and all of this. So just something to keep in mind. That's something that came actually to my mind because of past discussions I've had with people when we talked about what the episode was going to be. And so it may be sitting with you as the listener right now of, oh no, what is this going to do to me? Well, again, we'll come back to that at the end, but we shouldn't be scared or fearful of this kind of discussion. In fact, it's probably a very good discussion to have, but we'll get to that in a later question. The question we're moving to now is, so calling it the Gospel of Mark, who's the first person to speak about the authorship of it? Where does this name come from for us? Why do we call it Mark? Why do we call it Mark's Gospel?
So the first one to speak about the authorship of Mark, at least as far as we know, again, extant literature, like what do we have today to look at, is Papias, who lived end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, from about 60 to 130. He's quoted by Eusebius, who lived at the end of the 3rd century into the 4th century. So 260, 265 to 239, 240 is kind of his lifespan. And Eusebius says that Papias said that the gospel was written by John Mark and connects the writing of Mark to Peter. And I want you to hear the way that sounds. So Eusebius, who's writing, for easy math, let's say the year 300. Let's say Mark was written in 70, right? So you're talking about what, 230 years?
It's gonna be easy.
Later. There's a reason that I do ministry and not math. So 230 years after Mark is written, Eusebius says that I don't know who wrote it, but Papias, who lived 200 years before me said that John Mark wrote it. And, if you sit with that for a few minutes, you're like, we probably have to take that with a grain of salt. Because our first attribution to a specific person and a specific tradition comes 270 years after, but it's quoting someone 200 years before Eusebius. And so we get very far removed and a very questionable attribution. Again, I'm not saying it's not true, but what I tell people is you kind of have to hold that with a grain of salt. Someone saying, well, someone 200 years before me who is saying this 30 years after it was originally written says that so-and-so wrote it. And so you kind of have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. Here's what Eusebius says. He says, the elder also used to say, Mark, who had been Peter's interpreter, wrote down carefully, but not in order, all that he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings. For he had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, but later, as I said, one of Peter's. Peter used to adapt his teaching to the occasion without making a systematic arrangement of the Lord's sayings, so that Mark was quite justified in writing down some things just as he remembered them. For he had one purpose only, to leave out nothing that had been heard and to make no mistakes about it. There's two things in that I want to draw your attention to. Eusebius speaks about the ordering of events, which is likely because people were starting to ask questions about, well, the order of events in Mark are different than that in like Matthew or Luke. And so what makes these differences? And Eusebius says, well, Papias 200 years ago said that Mark was Peter's interpreter, and Peter was known to tell stories based on the occasion, so not always in order. And that's what leads Mark to writing his in an order that is different from the other Gospels. That's likely what's going on there, which to me is just interesting. Something else that I want to point out is this connection to Peter. So Eusebius says that Papias says that Mark is telling the stories as he heard them from the apostle Peter. And that led for a long time people reading Mark's gospel and just being like, yeah, these are tidbits of stories that Mark heard over time because he was close to Peter. And it neglected looking at the internal structure and literary devices used in the gospel. That is, we looked at him as just a collection of stories and not, Mark has a harmony. It has themes. It has foreshadowing. It has irony. It is a literary work. And so one of the things that I think is important about this discussion is saying you have to read Mark as a literary work and not like the vast majority of history. People are just like, well, it's just the stories of Peter. Maybe it is, but they're put together as a unified piece of literature by Mark or whoever it was that brought them together. This attribution to John Mark and connecting it to Peter is confirmed by others, such as Clement of Alexandria, who lived around the year 200, Irenaeus, who lived around the year 180, so the end of the 2nd century into the 3rd century, though both of these, it's believed, relied on Papias. And so most scholars believe everyone after Papias is relying on what Papias said to attribute the gospel to John Mark and connecting him to Peter. Such attributions, though, do not, and this is kind of important, arise out of purely neutral settings. A gospel's connection to an apostle was vital for the promotion of the gospels a particular author was in support of. So if an author believed that a certain gospel should be kept and be used by the church and accepted, one of the important things was that gospel needed to be connected back to an apostle. And so for someone like Papias or Eusebius to say, well, Mark wrote it and Mark knew Peter, we just have to not necessarily throw that out, but have to realize it is a little biased. They needed it to connect to an apostle, or maybe we should say wanted to connect it to an apostle in order to promote and to utilize this gospel. And so this has led scholar David De Silva to ask the two following questions, which I think are helpful for this discussion. The first one: did knowledge of a gospel's origins precede and assure the church's recognition of the apostolic witness of the gospel? Or did the church's recognition of a gospel's preserving an accurate reflection of the apostolic witness lead to traditions attributing the author of the gospel to a particular historic apostolic figure? Now, let me real briefly explain to you what that means. And I really like what De Silva says, because he's saying either way you look at it, the early church looked at a gospel such as the Gospel of Mark and said, this gospel holds apostolic truth. That is the truth of the gospel, the truth of the ministry of Jesus that dates all the way back to the apostles. But he's kind of asking the chicken and the egg thing, like which came first in terms to the connection to an apostle. He's saying, did the connection to the apostle come first? That is, Mark was first connected to Peter, and then that led people to say, well, because of that connection, this gospel holds the truth that goes all the way back to the apostles. Or did the church look at this document first and say, this is the truth that we've heard since the beginning? This gospel holds the truth that dates all the way back to the preaching and teaching of the apostles, and that then led the early church to try and connect it, and in some way, maybe in a questionable way, end up connecting that to an apostle, such as Peter. And the point that I want to emphasize is either way you look at it, you have the early church saying the Gospel of Mark contains truth that goes back to the apostles. But does that lead them to attribute it to an apostle, or did the attribution to an apostle come first? There's no way for us to say. Again, it's the chicken and the egg thing. Which came first? There's no way to say. But either way, they still believed that there was apostolic truth that was preserved in this gospel. That's why the early church preserved it. The second quote that he has, or question that he asks, he says, might an early tradition that a particular gospel took shape in a community guided by Matthew, for example, be transformed when apostolicity became important as an expression of the reliability of gospel writings into a claim that Matthew directly authored the gospel? A little bit of history here about how the canon came into being. Early on, you had these writings that were being passed around, Gospels, letters of Paul. Over time, churches began to bring these copies together in like codex or book form. Likely first, the Gospels were brought together and letters of Paul were brought together. And then eventually all of them are put together. But the church did not have to decide what books are inspired and what books are not until heresy entered in, until you had people like Marcion or Marcion, however you want to pronounce it, comes in and starts saying, well, these are inspired and these are not. And so once you had heresy or false teachers come in, the church had to decide, well, what books do we actually believe in? What books are orthodox? What books are we going to use as the foundation of our theology? And as they did that, there were some what people call criteria. I don't really like the term because they didn't really sit down with a checklist and say, well, does this book meet all the criteria? But it does kind of help to summarize the way that the church in general was thinking through what books are they going to preserve and what books are they not. And one of the ways one of the questions that they asked was this idea of connection to an apostle. So that wasn't something that was that important early on, but it became important as the church had to, because of the false teaching, decide what books are we going to rely on and to save and to preserve. And so what De Silva is asking is perhaps what happened is you have a gospel. He uses Matthew, for example, that they know this was written by someone in a community that was heavily shaped by the preaching of the apostle Matthew. And over time, when it became more important because of heresy to attribute a writing to an apostle, over time, the name Matthew becomes attached to it as if Matthew actually wrote it, though he didn't, but it was nevertheless produced in a community that was heavily influenced by Matthew, if that makes sense. Again, kind of a chicken and the egg thing of which came first. And there is debate to be had there. Again, we can't just assume it was one way or another. Nevertheless, and this is what I want to hit on, it was believed by the earliest of Christians and by the church universal over on that these books held the truth about Jesus that dates back to the apostles. And that might have led them to, attribute them to Peter or to Matthew or something like that, though they weren't actually written or connected to those people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's why, or at least part of why, some of the we've talked about some of the pseudepigraphal writings in the past and things like that, which have names attached to them for the purposes of being a lens, like through which to write or to interpret these things. But they were not, at least my understanding is, they were not understood as being inspired. This is truth. This is how we see things that are going on, and we want to tell it through the lens of a person who's best to talk about heaven. Enoch, because he was here and then he was not. He's probably got a good idea. That's the name we're going to attach to these, but they were not understood as being something from God telling the truth, that sort of deal, and all of this. Though they believed a lot of the things that were in there. That's why those things were written down. That's a little bit of a different deal. But to Spencer's point, as these things are being written, whether they know who authored it or not, they know that it is the truth. And that continues to persist onward to the point of, again, that chicken or egg thing of, well, we got to put a name to this. We got to, because we're trying to solve problems. If you know anything about church history and its development as it goes through, a lot of different problems start arising and different doctrinal teachings and things that they have to, how are we going to address this? And how are we going to address this? Well, you need to know what the baseline is. What's the truth, so that we can find out what is not the truth. But okay. So we have Papias. He's come up a bunch. All three times he's come up, it's been this later guy said that Papias said that this is that Mark wrote it. So the question we have now is, what Mark is he talking about? And what do we know about that Mark that may have had his name attributed to this gospel?
So most Christians throughout history, and this is probably what you'll hear today from someone who accepts the traditional authorship, is that John Mark wrote it. Now, this is a John Mark who is mentioned in a couple of places in Acts. You can look at the notes, and I have those verses there for you. Mentioned in a couple places in Acts as a traveling companion of Paul. And so that connects Mark with Paul actually more than it does with Peter. In other of Paul's writings, he mentions a Mark, but doesn't call him John Mark. And a lot of people have assumed this is the same Mark that we see in Acts, where he's called Mark, whose other name was John or something like that, is what Luke says. But then when you go to the writings of Peter, 1 Peter 5:13, Peter mentions a Mark. And people have assumed that the Mark that Peter mentions is the same Mark that knew Paul, the same John Mark that traveled with Paul in the book of Acts. And so, since these early writers, such as Papias, say, well, Mark wrote it and Mark knew Peter, they assume, well, this is the Mark mentioned in First Peter. And then people assume that that Mark is the same Mark who knew Paul. And then people assume that that Mark that knew Paul is the John Mark in Acts who traveled with him. That leads people to say John Mark wrote it. And I want you to notice how strained that is. Again, not the case, but it starts with, well, these early people, Papias, Clement, say Mark wrote it. Papias then says, well, Mark knew Peter. And we're like, okay, that has to be the Mark in First Peter, which we understand how we got there. Then it becomes a little bit of a stretch. Well, that's the same Mark written in Paul's letters. Okay. And then that Mark in Paul's letters is the same Mark that Luke calls John in Acts. Also a little bit of a stretch. So we go from logical to a little less logical to even less like it becomes, again, not the case, but you just have to, that's why I tell people you accept these things with a grain of salt, because it becomes more and more stretched out. And that leads back to something that I said earlier. Mark was a common Roman name in the first century. So just because a Mark wrote it, and even if that Mark knew Peter, it doesn't mean it's the Mark written in First Peter, nor does that mean that it's the Mark that Paul knew, nor when Paul talks about Mark in his letters, is that the Mark that traveled with him in Acts. Like that, we assume that because it's the same name, but there's a lot of reasons to assume that that's not necessarily the case because of how many people were named Mark. It would then be like Jack saying, I went out to eat with John, and you just assume, well, that John must be Spencer's dad because Jack knows Spencer and Spencer's dad's name John. And it's like, but my dad lives in Tyler, Texas. Jack lives in the Oklahoma City area. There's no Johns in Oklahoma City. Like, is it not more likely that Jack knows another John that is not a John that I know? And that's kind of what we try to do. And it's just, again, I'm not saying that that's not the case, but we have to take it with a lot of salt. I'd just be like, there's a lot of reasons to assume that we're talking about different marks, and not necessarily all the same one, because again, it was a common name. It's kind of like, maybe we'll talk about the authorship of some, maybe we'll talk about this when we get to John, but you have the Gospel of John, and then you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. 1st John does not give an author. 2nd and 3rd John are John the Elder. And we have, in Christian tradition, from the church fathers, a reference to 2 Johns, John the Apostle and John the Elder, which makes it difficult to assume that John the Elder in 2nd and 3rd John is John the Apostle, first off. But then we have to assume that it's the same one who wrote John the Gospel, which again, another common name of, it's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily not the case, but we're talking about common names. If it was an uncommon name, that would be a different story. But these are all very generic, common Roman or Hebrew names in the first century.
Yeah, I think the point with this answer here in particular, showing the degrees of separation or the hoops that you have to jump through in order to, I think it's this guy. Okay, well, how do we get to there? Well, we need to do this to this to this to this to this. Like, well, those don't necessarily equal each other. You know, there's breakdown in there and problems and stuff. Again, doesn't mean that's not the case, but certainly not something to be very hardline about. And again, something that we've kind of said and something we'll say at the end as well. The the faith and belief that we have is in the thing authored, not the author itself. The author itself is, these are Holy Spirit inspired writings sharing with us the truth of Jesus, of the apostles, and that's what our faith is built upon. What is authored, But it's not, well, if Mark didn't write it, then why am I even reading this thing? Well, because it's telling the truth. Who cares who wrote it? It is telling us the truth about who God is. Okay, next question here. What do we know for relative certainty from internal evidence about the author of Mark? So he doesn't say, I, Mark, wrote this, as you said, but what do we have internally within the writing that maybe points us in a Mark direction?
Practically nothing.
Okay. Good.
There's not a whole lot. Here's a few things that we do know. Some of these may seem obvious. Mark is a Christian, so it's written from the perspective of a believer in the things that he's writing about. Not so you take someone like Josephus, who was a Jewish historian of some credibility. The scholars again debate about how credible Josephus is, but Josephus, we get some mentions of some Christian-related things, but you also have to understand this is written by someone who's not a believer in Jesus as the Messiah. And so that's important for how you interpret those pieces of Josephus. And so when you look at something like the Gospel of Mark, it's also important to recognize that this is being written by a believer who is likely Jewish. He seems to know Jewish customs and explains them at some points, which seems to suggest also that he understands that at least a portion of his audience is not going to be Jewish and is going to need an explanation of some of these customs. He knows Old Testament things, and so he engages the Old Testament at points. He also seems to have some knowledge of Aramaic, and so we get some Aramaic sayings that carry over into the Gospel. So the Gospels were written in Greek. Most scholars believe that Jesus taught in and spoke Aramaic. So the Gospels become Greek translations of the sayings of Jesus, assuming that all the sayings date back to an Aramaic original. That's this historical discussion for a different day. But there's certain Aramaic phrases that carry over. So the sons of thunder for James and John, when Mark lists the apostles, I believe that's in John chapter 3. There's this name. It starts with a B. I don't remember it off the top of my head. It's a weird word. It's Aramaic. Like it's not a Greek term for sons of thunder. It's a Aramaic carryover. And so that seems to suggest that Mark has some kind of basic knowledge of Aramaic in the way that he uses those phrases. Not necessarily. He could just be repeating things that have carried on in the tradition, like the term Abba, father. Abba is the Aramaic term for father that carries over from the ministry of Jesus and was probably used by Greek speakers that didn't know Aramaic. So that's a possibility, but likely had some kind of knowledge of Aramaic. He obviously had some education. He could read and write, which most people in the first century could not. He knew, as I mentioned, Aramaic. He knew Greek because that's what it's written in. There are also some Latin loanwords, so he probably had some familiarity with Latin as well, so some kind of education. Does it tell us very much about who wrote it? There's a lot of Jewish Christians who have some kind of education. Paul's a prime example. So connecting it to a Mark internally is very difficult to do. Some people try to do that with the way that Peter's presented. That fits a lot better with the themes of the gospel. The themes of the gospel of Mark is, one of them is discipleship. So he focuses a lot normally on the failure of the disciples. And so Peter is one of the central disciples. He takes a prominent theme in all of the gospels. I don't think that in any way makes it necessary that Mark knew Peter or was reciting Peter's version of events. I will say, just from a scholarly perspective, most form and redaction critics see multiple levels of tradition in most of Mark's stories. So they try to tease apart the stories and see how they developed over time, which makes it unlikely that it went straight from Peter, from the actual events of Jesus through Peter, who was there, and straight to Mark, and then written them down. As I said, at the very minimum, Mark puts these together in a literary fashion and makes kind of a cohesive piece of literature out of them.
Boanerges, I think is I don't know if that's the right way
There
to
you go.
say
See,
it,
I
but
told you it
that's
was a
what it
tough
is.
word.
Boethius it is not, which is what I said kind of under my breath there. He's some like late 5th century Roman guy. I have no idea why I know that name. Some movie or something. But anyway, yeah, so there's not a lot here to there are this becomes exposed a little more when we look at other writings and you have we've already mentioned like Luke and even the argument for John with their gospels of at least there are some things that seem to point like to a specific person. These are all very Jewish Christian that's educated. Like, well, okay, that doesn't really knock off a lot of boxes here. There's still a lot of people in the lineup
Mm-hmm.
that could be, guilty of this.
And we'll talk about this in Luke, but like the Lord's Supper narrative in Luke matches up in some unique ways with 1 Corinthians 11 that is not
Mhm.
present in Matthew or Mark,
Yeah.
which connects Luke with Paul in some form. But you think about Jewish Christian with some education, it's the same description as the author of Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what we know internally about the authors of Matthew and Mark are no different. So you could flip them and say that Matthew wrote Mark and Mark wrote Matthew, and you'd have the same internal evidence to say that, or really any other Jewish Christian with some education.
Fair enough. Okay, so all of this being said, what's the likelihood that John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark in our New Testament?
So here's what I believe. You don't have to agree with me, but here's where I land. I think there's a decent likelihood that it is authored by a second generation Christian named Mark. By second generation, I mean someone who was not there at the beginning, so not an apostle who walked around with Jesus, someone who heard these things secondhand and then wrote them down. I date the Gospel of Mark to around the year 70, so someone who potentially could have been alive during the ministry of Jesus, but was not around for it, who was not a part of that first, who hears it all secondhand. And the reason that I say that is because if you were making up from scratch an author of a gospel, you would not choose John Mark. You would not choose someone named Mark. That's not who you would. You would choose a first generation Christian and likely an apostle, right? You would want someone who was there at the beginning, who was with Jesus, and you would likely want someone with a big name. So, like a John, or maybe even like a Matthew, but like Matthew is not one of the best known apostles. And if your Mark is connected to Peter, but if you were making up a name, you would just call it Peter. You would choose Peter's a great choice for a name of a gospel. He was the most important apostle, probably. He was there from the very beginning. He was given the keys to the kingdom, Jesus said, right? That would be a great person to say, well, Peter wrote it, not, well, there's this guy named Mark that we really don't know anything about, but we believe that he knew Peter and he was the guy who wrote it.
Yeah.
Not very likely that you would make that up. So that seems to suggest to me that there's a decent likelihood that someone by the name of Mark, who is a second generation Christian, wrote it. If it was written by a Mark, though, it is very difficult to say who this Mark was or whether or not he had any connection to Peter. So I would say you wouldn't make up the name Mark, but just the name Mark doesn't get us all that close to an author. As I've said, it was a very common name. We don't know who the Mark was who was mentioned in First Peter. So even if we want to say, okay, Peter wrote First Peter, the Mark that he talks about is the same Mark, which there's a little bit of a stretch in doing that, right? Papias says that, but it's not the most reliable tradition we have. But even if we want to say that, that doesn't get us all the way to, well, what Mark is this? It doesn't get us to the John Mark in Acts. It doesn't get us to the Mark mentioned in Paul's writings. it at best gets us to a Mark who knew Peter, which is still a little bit questionable. We also have to realize the bias reasons, as I said, to try and connect the gospel to an apostle. So for me, I'm very hesitant to accept the Mark connected to Peter. Mark's something that you wouldn't create. The connection to Peter is something that you could imagine might be a little strained. So I'm not accusing Papias or somebody of making it up. But when we're biased, we make connections that there's not very good reason to make. Like that's just what we do. And so I would want to say, yeah, there's a lot of reasons for them to connect it to Peter, even out of a good heart in wanting to do that, of making a connection that they really have no business trying to make. So I'm a little hesitant to connect it to Peter, but Mark is something that you wouldn't make up, a connection you wouldn't make likely without a pretty good reason to make it, in my opinion. And so I'm fine with attributing the gospel to Mark, but I would not want to base my interpretation of the gospel on any more details about the identity of this Mark. And by that, I mean, I know some people, they'll read a passage and they'll say, well, it has to mean this because John Mark wrote it and John Mark knew Peter. And that's where I'm like, I wouldn't go that far. Even if you want to say, and I have no problem with it, that John Mark wrote it and John Mark knew Peter, there's enough questions to say, well, I can't base an interpretation on that. I can't say the primary reason I interpret this story in this way is because of the connection to Peter. That would be one of my important qualifiers, is just to warn us not to take it quite that far, even if we want to accept fully the historical attribution of the gospel.
So you've already started to touch on this part here, but as we wrap up the conversation on this, we had a couple thoughts on why does this matter? Why does it matter? Why have this discussion? I don't know if you want to flip what we have written here since you already brought up interpretation, but I'll leave that up to you, and I'll throw some thoughts there at the end.
Yeah, I'll start there with an interpretation of just not basing our interpretation too heavily on an author that we don't know very much about and we don't know for sure is the author. And that's less the case with Mark, as I've found it is with the other gospels. So Matthew and John believing that an apostle wrote them, that comes a lot more into play of, well, John was there when this happened. And that might lead to one interpretation or another, as we'll talk about when we get to John. We have to be hesitant there because, again, we have just as little evidence for the authorship of Matthew and John as we do for the Gospel of Mark. Luke is a lot of the times identified as Luke, the physician. And so we interpret Luke as if he's a doctor. There's a lot of uncertainty there as well, even though, I'll kind of say this before we get there. I think Luke's a reasonable person who could have written the gospel. Whether or not he's a physician is a little bit questionable, though we'll talk about that when we get there. But Mark less so than the other gospels, we tend to do that. But as a whole, just so we don't have to repeat this throughout the series, is that don't base your interpretation too heavily on an author that we know very little about and have very little attributions to that author. The second one, the reason that I think this is important is I think it's very important for our faith. And here's why I believe that. I get some pushback sometimes for some of the scholarly stuff that we do here or even in church about people worried that it'll destroy the faith of non-Christians or new Christians or young Christians, so younger people or younger generations in our church. And there's a couple things that I always say to that is, first, as a younger person, I've seen a lot of young people lose their faith. I'm part of the generation that kind of began the process of younger people leaving the church when they grow up and move out of their house. And I have yet to see anyone whose faith was destroyed by talking about these things in the context of the church. When their church was willing to talk about some of these difficult questions, some of the historical things in the safe environment of a community of faith or in a family, I've never seen that. Still to this day, I've never seen that destroy a person's faith. What I have, more times than I can count, seen is a person's faith destroyed by being introduced to some of these historical things once they have gotten out on their own in places that I think are less safe than a Christian community. At school, especially now online, on YouTube, on TikTok, these things are out there everywhere. I see videos all the time. That's the place that I've seen people's faith destroyed because their faith was built on a foundation that didn't know how to integrate them. But people that grew up being taught these things and how to develop a faith that integrates some of this scholarship, some of this historical approach, their faith was much stronger and wasn't destroyed when they came across new things, when they left out in to the real world, so to speak. So it seems to me when it comes to faith, we're left with one of two options. We can, in essence, I think, lie to ourselves and others and just let's pretend like these things don't exist. Let's build a foundation of faith on things that are not entirely accurate or not entirely true, which is to build a foundation of faith that is weak, very easily destroyed when someone comes across the history or science or whatever it is that is mostly universally believed by people in the world. Or we can be honest, truthful to ourselves and to others, and say, here's what we know about science, about history. Here's what scholars say about things. And not that we have to accept it all, but let's find a way to integrate that into the foundation of faith so we have a foundation that can stand and is solid and strong and is not going to be easily destroyed by scholarly opinion or history or science or whatever that people might be introduced to by people that they know or online or whatever it may be. And so I do think these conversations are crucial to faith because I think we have to find a way to integrate this information into our faith. So you take something like the authorship of Mark, like I said, you can even end up by saying, yes, John Mark, who knew Peter, wrote this. That can be a part of your faith. But it has to be so in a way where you understand, yeah, but I understand that the evidence isn't great. And so here's some of the reasons why I believe it was written by who I believe it was written by. The final thing that I would say is that if your faith is destroyed because John Mark didn't write Mark, I would also say your faith is probably in the wrong place. I would recommend let's place our faith in Jesus and let scientists do science things, historians do historical things. Let's listen to scholars, find a way to integrate these things into our faith that's built upon Jesus, not built upon who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or any of the other things that we might talk about on this podcast. Those are important to integrate into our faith, but they're not ultimately where our faith resides.
Yeah, I want to second especially the comment about having the conversations within a church environment versus other environments. I have argued the same thing and as a result preached or taught on various cultural topics that are everywhere, homosexuality and transgenderism and all those sorts of things, because our kids are hearing it, will hear more of it and all of that, and it needs to be discussed within the walls of the church in an environment where we can have active dialogue and communication about these things. Because I have seen plenty of times nobody, my preacher never said anything about maybe Mark didn't write Mark, and they're hearing it from somebody that more than likely went, well, Mark maybe didn't write this. That's why I'm not a Christian. And they're hearing it from that source. There's something uh, there have been a few things that I have been able to hear and being the listener and going, haven't heard that before, but the person I'm hearing it from is a very faithful follower. So this thing doesn't have to destroy me, even if I come to a different conclusion from them. this is something that I haven't heard. However, I can still continue. I can still be somebody who is a faithful follower in all of this. Whereas if it's in an unsafe environment, like Spencer says, they might hear that and go, "Oh, this wasn't talked about, and it's not true. Therefore, I can't trust anything." Well, that's not the case. But that's all the more reason to have the kind of conversations that we're having here. So we're going to have more of them. This does it for our Mark discussion, at least for now. But there are more of these who wrote the Gospels to come here soon. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Did we destroy your faith today? Let us know that so that we can be helpful in steering you back and talking you off the ledge there. As far as that stuff goes, let us know what other things you'd like to see from us as well. We've teased it a tiny bit. We have some ideas in the works and stuff. Don't know when those things will happen, but we're definitely thinking about doing some more and expanding into some different things that we discuss. So we solicit your ideas as well and are open to those things at our email, strongchurchministries@gmail.com, on our Facebook, Thinking Theologically, and anywhere else that you might be on. You can find Spencer there, I'm sure, giving takes about theological things and, I don't know, probably basketball and other stuff like that. We'll see you next time. I'm Jack. That's Spencer.